This is episode 56 of the Magic Detective Podcast. On this episode, you'll hear about the life of Al Flosso, the Coney Island Fakir. That and more on this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast, your podcast home for magic history. I'm your host, Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective, and this is episode 56. This, by the way, is the second to the last episode for season 2. I'm going to wrap things up a little bit early this season. I've got some big things in store for season 3, so this will give me a little extra time to work on those. So today we experience a first on the Magic Detective Podcast, and that is we have a guest. We have an interview that we're doing, or just a conversation, I like to think. And our guest today is Judge Gary Brown. He's a graduate of Columbia College and the Yale Law School. He's also a freelance writer and magic historian. He's written articles on magic and related topics for numerous popular magazines, including American Heritage, Emmy, Invention and Technology, Audacity, and Antiques and Collecting, as well as magic magazines including Genie, Mum, and Magic. His articles have appeared in 3 languages in the United States, Europe, and New Zealand. The Coney Island Fakir was Judge Brown's first book, and we are very fortunate to have him with us today. So, Gary, welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast.
I am honored and grateful to be here. As you know, I'm one of your biggest fans, as well as a big fan of magic history in general. So thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And I should let the listeners know it's because your continued encouragement that we're finally getting to the interviews. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Your point being I nudged you into doing this. That's okay.
No, it's I needed it. So it's perfect. So today we're talking about Al Flosso. Now, I know that Al was born October 10th, 1895 in New York City. His name was Albert Levinson. So tell us, how did he get the name Flosso?
Oh, that's a great question. And the answer depends on who you ask. My best efforts suggested that it was because his mother's nickname was his mother's maiden name was Flosterstein, and the kids called him Floss, and it turned into Flosso. That's what I learned. I learned that from Jackie. I learned it from a couple of other places. There are 1 or 2 other variants on the story. I'll leave one for you. I think you came up with something different. Am I right about that?
Well, I happened to look it up on Wikipedia, and they said that it was like a slang term for cotton candy. And that's how, I guess, being associated with Coney Island, somehow that's how he got the name. But sounds like yours is probably more accurate.
Probably. But I'll give you one that's completely inaccurate because it's so good. And it sort of tells you more about Flosso than any of the other stories.
Okay.
So while I'm writing the book, I had the great opportunity through a friend to get interviews with Jay Marshall. And Jay Marshall said, when you ask Flosso where he got his name from, he slid into his W.C. Fields accent, and he would tell you some story about a little dog. Let me tell you about a little dog. And I literally have that line in the book. He told you a story about a little dog. I had no idea what the story was, but that's the best I had, and that's all I had. Sure. So I put that in there. Well, one day I had the opportunity to spend some time with Max Maven, one of the great magicians and magic historians of our day. He knows everything.
Yeah.
And he said, I read your book. And Gary, have you heard the story about the little dog? And I said, no. He said, let me tell you the story. And Max, in his accent, tells me the story, right, with his affectation, which was just great. But in essence, he would tell a story about getting his first job. And that Flosso said he went to like some carnival. And he's doing tricks. And that's all right, kid. That's all right. What do you call yourself? I don't really call myself anything. Well, here's the deal. Here's what you do. I got a dog in this show, Flosso the Wonder Dog. Now, if you're willing to change your name to Flosso the Wonder Boy, I only have to change 2 letters on the sign, and we're in business. So what do you say? So he claimed to have changed his name to fit the sign of the deceased Wonder Dog. I believe that to be completely untrue and also very funny, right? Which was one of the problems was writing about a guy like Flosso. I mean, he would tell you a story. I mean, he knew everything in magic. He knew everybody, but he also, because it was a bit of business, he would tell a story that would then say, well, that's where his name came from. That was not true, but it's hilarious. And I was grateful to Max for sharing that with me.
Wow, I love that. So, so Al, born in 1895, so it's just the start of this century. Who in magic inspires him to become a magician?
Yeah, so my best recollection on that, and I have to check. I think it was. I mean, he certainly saw Harry Blackstone, right? But much earlier, when Harry Blackstone was Harry Boughton. Right?
Okay.
I believe he had access to him, and that was one of the first people he saw. Later on, he was very inspired by Downs and some other people. He often told the story about Downs' book, right? The modern coin manipulation, the art of magic. Having watched T. Nelson Downs perform, said you bought the book thinking, now I can do that. And those books were designed to show you that you couldn't do that. In other words, Downs gave up his story, his act in this book, but he didn't give up his story, which is you have to practice for 800,000 hours to do this. And so it was, so frustrating for the young Flosso trying to learn to be a coin manipulator.
What kind of magician was Al Flosso?
Yeah, so he was very much a kind of 10-in-1 show magician, which meant he did his act over and over and over again. And that act became ultimately the Miser's Dream is the centerpiece of it. But there are production pieces in there. He produces silks, he does the paper hat tear, he builds a lot of things, and he had a polished act. It's not to say he didn't do a lot of other things. While I was interviewing magicians, people would say to me, did you ever see him do the egg bag? His egg bag was phenomenal. Now, at that time, the internet was a lot leaner than it is today. You didn't have much stuff. I have since seen him do his egg bag on, which is a kids show from New York City from that time, or when I was young, in the 70s. He did the egg bag using a punch whistle because he was a Punch and Judy operator as well. Okay, and it's hilarious because he's got these kids. He's doing the egg bag that we've all seen 1,000 times. But every time the kid puts the hand in the bag, he would blow the punch whistle. The kids are jumping out of their skin. So it's hilarious. And just in preparation for this, I was looking to see other videos I hadn't seen before. I had heard an account of him doing the card duck. Was it Joanne? The card duck, right? And I finally I caught a video online of him doing that on a talk show in the 70s with Bob McAllister. And he does it in such a way. I mean, it's just so smooth and funny and whatever. But the part he didn't do, I had written about in the book, was he would blindfold the duck, which some people do. And he supposedly wrote the Peking duck joke, because he would have one eye sticking in. Look at that! I got a Peking duck on my hands, whatever. But his magic was all that sort of pack small, plays big, act in a satchel. I mean, if you can think of an act that would fit in a bag you can sling over your shoulder. He didn't do didn't do that stuff. When you want a nightclub magician, he's your guy. Give him a deck of cards, you get entertained all night. He was that kind of practical, low rent magician in the sense of having small stuff. His background included the Punch and Judy shows, right? It included the magic acts. It included and I loved writing about this, the slum pitch act, right? They used to call these slum packets. For a dime, they would sell you all these things, half of which didn't work, or they were kind of more gags than they were magic. But his ability to sell that stuff is, I think, what led him to become one of the great dealers in our time. First in straight magic, and then in magic and collectibles. He was one of the first collectibles dealer because he started recognizing that people wanted things that had collectible value. He had a kind of an interesting career that way.
Wow. Now, was he a vaudeville performer, or was that after, or did he miss that?
Yeah, I think he kind of missed that. I mean, there were certainly vaudeville type dates that he did, right? But he cut his teeth in the old railroad circuses, right? They did the sideshow stuff. He worked with the three-legged man and the lion-faced man, and he was actually the manager for Lionel the Lion-Faced Man, which had some unbelievably funny sides to it. And so he worked in those kind of rough crowds. As Teller said to me when we were writing the book, and I quoted him, he said he worked at a time when the crowds smelled bad. you know. And if you think about that, that's what Flosso was all about. He said, you want to get to be good at magic, kid? He'd tell some, startup, you want to do what I do? All you have to do is do the same act over and over again, thousands and thousands of times for crowds who couldn't care less. And you know what? At the end of that, you'll be a pretty good magician.
That is sage advice right there. That's so true. So he's maybe the latter part of vaudeville. How long was he in Coney Island?
That's the funny part. Not that long, right? He did a couple of seasons, I think it was, as I remember. It was a few seasons with the Dreamland Circus sideshow, right? There was the Dreamland sideshow. But by that time, he'd been performing for more than a decade in sideshows all over the country.
Gotcha.
He went through the different, again, the railroad circuses and different, he was there right around the time when the sideshows were falling apart, right? Because they were, the railroad circuses went out, and then they became sort of like truck shows, and that's like going into the 20s into the 30s. And that's about the time when he got out of it. Now, when I say get out of it, once he became a dealer, he's located in New York, he's still doing club dates, running around. He could perform his show 8 or 9 times in a night in Manhattan, right? Because
wow.
different nightclubs, different venues, different conventions in town. And he would run around all over the place doing these hotel, stage type shows.
Yeah. And,
he had a name, though. He would always tell his, agent, get me $1 more than anybody else has ever worked for, and I'll do it. He was always kind of like negotiating. He had that corny side to him. So, and there's one amusing quick anecdote I'll tell you. I mentioned in the book, and this apparently happened more than once. But there was one night where he went to a show. I think it was like a furrier's convention, and he runs in and he gets on the stage and he does his act and he kills. And his agent calls him the next day and said, "Al, where were you last night?" "What do you mean? You missed that convention." "What are you talking about? I had the meat out of my hand. I did the Miser's Dream. I did this. I did that. The furriers loved it." He said, "Furriers? You were playing the plumbers convention last night." We just walked into the wrong convention and just performed. So, it's that kind of quick sort of, busy lifestyle. It's something that we can't even really relate to as much today,
Wow. Interesting. So he's only in Coney Island, and yet that is the name that he gets known by.
Yeah, so that was the thing that happened. He was, he performed as the King of Coins with Kaye's. He played the Boy Magician, the Wonder Boy, different things. But he was introduced at some variety show, and it was Milton Berle was the MC. And Milton Berle, knowing he had this sort of sideshow background, he was associated with Coney Island. He gets up and said, "And here he is, Al Flosso, the Coney Island Fakir." And Flosso goes, "Oh no, that's it. That's my name. That's the name I've been looking for." And that's how he became the Coney Island Fakir.
Wow. So it comes from Milton Berle.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is a future question on the Magic Detective podcast. Let me tell you, I love that. Awesome. Very cool. Wow. Okay. So he's, everybody knows Flosso. He's in New York City. Everybody knows him. Tell me about well, first off, me and the Houdini connection. Tell me about Flosso and Houdini. What kind of relationship did they have?
Yeah, so that's great. So when you play that, like the 6 degrees of separation game, because of my work with Jackie Flosso, and obviously I'm like, 3 steps removed from Houdini, which is kind of cool, right?
Awesome.
So when he's growing up, Flosso works for Houdini. He's still young at this point. I'm trying to remember the timing, but it's toward the end of Houdini's life. And he had a job. He did 2 things. He was buying illusions for Houdini. He would be like one of his stage managers who would buy supplies and illusions and that kind of thing. But also he started selling Eliot's Last Legacy, which is one of Houdini's books. I guess I don't really know much about it. And he talks about it, that he actually made quite a good living selling these books for $1 a copy. And somewhere I read that Flosso had said that the books were even like physically defective. There was like something wrong with the bindings or whatever, but it didn't matter. It was Houdini's book and he was pushing it. He was selling it to everybody. So that was one connection with Houdini. They were also, I think, friends. Houdini used to come to watch Flosso perform at Coney Island.
Okay.
And when Flosso got married, Houdini came down and met with him and said, "I'm going to give you a gift. And this is a gift that's going to make sure that you and your new wife never go hungry." And he handed him a package which had a notebook inside. And inside that notebook was Houdini had written out his mind reading code. The mind reading code.
The Roosevelt belief.
Yes. And he gave that to Flosso as a wedding gift.
Wow.
And for a couple of years, thereafter, Flosso and his wife performed a mind reading act. She was Madame Xenia, and it didn't last too long. I think in part because his wife had baby Jack, and she got off the road. But there were a few like flyers I had with her as Madame Xenia and the Great Owl Flosso, and they were going to do this mind reading act, and it was clearly the Houdini act that they got as a wedding gift.
Fascinating. Wow, that is cool. You had mentioned pre-interview that he was good buddies with Dunninger.
Yeah, very good buddies with Dunninger. So Dunninger, he and Dunninger spent tons of time together. Dunninger used to come back to the shop and hang out and read the books, and they would spend hours and hours together. There's all kinds of stories of them forgetting people in the shop and leaving and going out, just hilarious stuff. But in watching that interview I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, and it's, it sort of shows you the kind of marketing perception of the world. He's asked on this TV show in the 70s, who's the greatest magician who ever lived? Well, clearly that would be Houdini. He does this little shtick. He says, but since Houdini died, the greatest magician ever is the mentalist, Dunninger. He's got it. And he doesn't even have a real reason for it. He's just he's got it all. He's got the act. He's the thing. He's the guy. No. The interviewer doesn't know enough to say, oh, and Al, isn't he also your best friend? Right? Like that was the follow-up question that never happened. But they were very close, and it was actually a very sweet relationship. When Dunninger died, Flosso didn't live much longer, and they said that part of it was that he was really crushed over the long. Yeah.
Well, what's ironic about that I find out from you that they're best friends is I read a quote online from Dunninger saying that Al Flosso was the greatest magician.
Right.
So I guess they have this pact. Whenever you're asked, just it's you, it's me, it's you, it's me.
Yeah, and also if you look at some of the old magic magazines, you see Flosso pushes some of Dunninger's products like the Hypno Specs, the fake eyeglasses, the X-ray goggles or whatever. It was interesting to hear a few magicians related to me. You go into Flosso's shop was famously a mess, right? It was just like it's dirty and dusty, and there were wood floors, and it was like it was like 1,000 years old. And they said you walk into this disaster of a place. And in it is this man, this very distinguished looking gentleman, sitting on a chair with his hands folded, his walking stick, and it's Dunninger, right? Who, I don't know if was sort of faked an English accent.
Oh yeah.
But he had this sort of affected, aristocratic air. Mm-hmm. And basically, to walk in and run into Dunninger in the middle of this, this thieves market essentially was really quite a shocking, image.
I also read about the Marx Brothers. The Marx Brothers come up in Flosso's story. So what is the connection there?
Yeah, so there's a couple sort of looser connections. They grew up in the same neighborhood.
Wow.
There's some friends in common and so forth. But what happens when they make one of the movies, and I want to say it was A Night at the Opera. I'd have to double check that. But they needed a Punch and Judy operator, right?
Oh, okay.
And one of the joys. I'm just going to go on a little tangent here, which maybe you'll edit later. But in researching this and other things I did later, was working with Jack Flosso. Jack Flosso, like his father, could tell a story. And he said, "I tell you, at the time, my dad worked with the Marx Brothers." And I said, "No." So he tells me this story. They hire. If you've ever seen the film, Flosso is the Punch and Judy operator, and eventually Harpo steps into the show, and there's a little puppet costume hanging around his neck, and he's getting hit by Punch and hitting him back and whatever, and he destroys the show. That's part of the deal. You don't see Flosso at all, but he's working the puppets. And he said, my father had to go to their rehearsal, where the studios. I think it was New Jersey. I'm not 100% on that, but he might have gone out to California. I'm not sure. But he says he goes into this place, he says, and it's madness. He said they're, backstage, was like inside one of their movies. They were like bookies and racetrack touts and hangers on, people running on. They had, the women, Harpo was chasing the women around. He said it was just like being in the movie, And he said my father got Harpo to stick around just long enough so he could measure his neck to make the puppet costume for him, because Flosso made that for the movie. He said, but Harpo said, listen, look around you. There ain't no rehearsal. We're not going to do a rehearsal. Not to practice. If the cameras are going to roll, you just do your thing, I'll do my thing, and that's it. you know. And he's like, all right, thanks. And that was it. And that's what's in the movies. It was just something and you can see if you watch the movie, it's complete chaos. But he said that was how they lived, you know. So my father had this experience, said Jack, you know, of walking in and seeing the Marx Brothers. And he said, but it was like being inside the movie when the cameras weren't rolling.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So
I'm gonna have to go back and check out that movie now, just for that. So Al isn't even on camera; he's behind the scenes running the.
Well, you do see
puppets.
he had this little puppet theater, and he's working the puppet, right? That the theater he uses there, I don't believe is the theater he actually used. They say most Punch and Judy operas had this big kind of bulky thing, and he had schlepped it around the thing. He had a thing that he built that he'd fit on his shoulders, and it was just a flat top over his head. So it wasn't like it didn't have the curtains and the whole scene, but he could break it down and pack it and go. And if you think about it, again, that's the whole sort of the traveling magician ideal.
That's
big wheeled thing that you got a big crate you got to wheel around. Yeah, so something that breaks down and folds up is quite valuable. And he built a custom stage, and a few of the Punch and Judy operators I interviewed were just blown away by it. They were like, I wish I had something like that. That thing he built was unbelievable, you know. So it's interesting. And if I may, can I share one other thing?
Yeah.
So Punch and Judy comes back one more time in his life. He stops doing that in the day. He actually handed off his puppets to, I think, Jay Marshall, who took over that job because it sort of waned interest in that. It's still the occasional birthday party. Many years later, fast forward into the 70s. So we're talking about like from the 40s into the 70s, like, you know, quarter of a century later or so. Yeah. He gets a call. Flosso's in the shop. He's an old man at this point, and he gets a call from Jim Henson. And Jim Henson's on the phone. He's like, I'm sorry, you're the guy with like the Muppets with those things and all of the high-tech special effects. Yes, says Jim Henson. We're having a convention, puppeteers convention. We want you to perform. You want me to perform? I got a couple of battered old like Punch and Judy figures and a little thing that fits on my shoulders. You got the Sesame Street Playhouse with the high tech. What? Trust me, says Jim Henson. They will love it. And he went up to I think it was upstate New York. There was a American Puppeteers Convention, and he performed his act. And there was a whole move he did where there was a monkey character in Punch and Judy, and there's a stick that gets thrown back and forth. Now, this is a guy who's doing this over his head who can't see, but yet he could throw the stick between the two figures and catch it and not miss it. And they said the puppeteers were absolutely blown away because, you know, it was one of those things that, you know, none of them could do because he had done it 10,000 times.
Yeah, no kidding.
You know? So it was sort of interesting to me to have this sort of this little piece of history come back. I mean, the Muppets are still relevant today. They're still making movies and television shows, whatever, you know. And here's a guy who in the 30s is running around in these railroad sidecars that shows where, you know, he's got a three-legged man sitting next to him and, you know, the small people and heavy people and, you know, Kiko and Iko, the ambassadors from Mars. and the same stuff that worked then work now, which is amazing, right? I
Fantastic. Jim Henson. It's funny how when you're in a particular genre, how you love the history of it. I mean, we love the history of magic. They love the history of puppetry. Right. And, you know, whether it's ventriloquism or whatever it is, it's like, you know, oh, yeah, I want to see a guy from 70 years ago. I, you know, can't wait to be part of that and experience it.
Yeah, this is a complete sort of tangent in the center to what we're talking about. But if you think about it, right, you and I love digging up old, like, historic magic pieces. We've talked about a few of them recently, right? The different things you find in an old book. You know, I've done the edible candle, which was popular in the 1850s.
Yes.
And I've done it in nightclubs today, and it works. It still works. It's different, you know. But it's quite interesting. If you think about the miser's dream almost makes no sense today. Because you bring somebody in the audience, out of the audience, and you say, okay, I'm going to make you a millionaire. This was Flosso, right? A millionaire for 4 minutes time or whatever. 5 minutes time is going to be a millionaire. And then you proceed to produce a handful of $50.
Yeah.
In today's world, people don't even use $50, right?
No.
I mean,
coins today.
Yeah, right? So what relevance is that? Well, I have to tell you, there was a guy, forgive me, I'm terrible with names. I'm not going to remember his name. He just went to FISM to the championships in Korea. I don't think he won, but he won here, right?
Wow.
And he did a miser's dream routine. And I know that actually Lance Burton and Jeff McBride had a lot to do with training this fellow. He was really good. But he did a miser's dream where he produced credit cards and bills and a gold bar, right? The piece of gold bar. All of a sudden, it's interesting. He's using ATM cards and credit cards, and he's doing, but it was very similar. It wasn't exactly a monster dream, but it was very similar in terms of the moves and so forth, but it made it relevant. I mean, audiences today, I was in one where like, holy crap, that's a gold bar, right? That's something, Yeah. Whereas if you produce $4.50 today, it's still interesting. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that people doing miser's dream should stop, but think about the crowds that had to scrape together a nickel or a dime to go see Flosso and 10 other acts.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, with $5 silver dollars or $half in their hands, that was a bigger impact then. So history gives us two different things. There are techniques, and then there's also themes. And how do you play off those themes? Well, one theme would be to take $5 half dollars and make it a gold bar, right? That would be interesting to modern audiences, So that's just something I would throw in there. Magic history is worth looking at for those reasons, right?
Oh, totally. I remember when I had been doing Miser's Dream for a number of years, and the thought occurred to me, what if I used a clear bucket as opposed to the metal bucket? My only concern was, could you hear, the sound? Because let's face it, in the Miser's Dream, that's 90% is the sound it makes. Right. I mean, there are stories of T. Nelson Downs forgetting his coins, walking out on stage with nothing and mimicking it. And, yet you get the sound from the bucket because he's got those coins, but nothing else. Yeah. And so, with the bucket I had, it was a plastic bucket, but it had these ridges all the way around. So what it basically did, you could see my hand in there, but you couldn't see my hand in there. So I could do everything you could do with a regular bucket.
Very cool.
And it played. I had a couple magicians that saw it and said, "I can't believe what you did. That was incredible." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's not a gimmick bucket, yet in a way, it is."
Right.
And it's so cool. But that's again thinking, how do you update this? And that was my contribution to the whole thing. Let's get back to the magic shop. So this shop begins as Martinka's. It becomes, I guess at the time, there's Martinka's and there's Hornman's Magic Shop, and Hornman buys Martinka's from the Martinka brothers when they decide to retire. Right. And then Hornman has it for a while. And now I may be wrong on this. I know Houdini and Charles Carter are both owners at some point. I don't know if they owned Martinka's or Hornman's or which one, but they're involved. And then eventually Frank Ducrot gets it. Right. And along with Frank Ducrot is Daisy White, who's a demonstrator in the shop. And by the way, if you want to learn any more about Daisy White, check out podcast episode 24, because I talk about Daisy White like nobody's ever heard. It's an excellent episode. So Frank Ducrot dies. There you go.
I picture Frank Ducrot for you. Go ahead. Yes.
Awesome. So Ducrot dies. What happens then?
So the show, the shop comes up for sale. I believe that's the point at which Flosso bought it. He tried to buy it earlier, but he was like a road magician. He was out somewhere in Omaha or something, and he just missed the opportunity. He wanted to. I think when Charles Carter bought it, he actually said, "I was interested then, but I just couldn't get back in time and do it." And he probably didn't have the money. But by this time, he'd put a few dollars away. He had a kid. He didn't want to be on the road forever, and he decided to buy this shop. Right. And this shop has, and, I saw him in a recent interview that I watched recently, it was back in the 70s. Every time he'd tell the story of the shop, it changed a little bit. It was the oldest shop in 1854. Like, I don't know if he was right on the dates, you know what I mean? But it was clearly, it was this shop that had moved from the Martinka brothers, where they founded the Society of American Magicians, as you well know. It's another episode you want to cite there. But
yes.
Yeah. And which is an exciting place, right? And then eventually it's bought by Charles Carter, who was much more interested in being a touring illusionist than running a shop. Houdini, who was really interested, and he bought it around, I want to say, the time of the last pandemic. I want to say when it was around 1919 or thereabouts, because he was very into the movie business.
Yeah.
So he bought this thing, but it wasn't really his thing. And then he gets out of it. He pushes it off on his partner, I think. And it goes to Ducrot. Ducrot runs it for a while. The funny part there, the funny contrast there is Ducrot, they say, was very much like a pharmacist. He had like every drawer labeled with alphabetical things, whatever. And when Flosso had it, it was just a heap. It was just a disgraceful mound of things. Because he did not have this sort of organizational capacity. At the same time, he would say, "What do you want, kid? Oh, one of those. I want to know somebody." And he'd just dive under some pile and come out like it was like a rat's nest. That's and some pictures, and I have a few in the book of him in the shop. And the human mind can't even absorb what's there. They said he knew where every single thing was. He was the shop of three wonders. You wonder if I have it. I wonder if I can find it, or I wonder if I can get it, and everybody wonders how I found it. Like that's like that was the but you could find anything at Flosso's, right? And he said, and what was interesting about how he ran the shop was there was definitely this sort of sideshow carny aspect. Rich kid walked in, the prices went up. I had heard this described to me so many times. I didn't experience it until few years ago when another dealer, I'll go nameless for the purpose of this, kind of an older fellow now passed, I tried to buy something from him, and it just reminded me of what people said about Flosso. Everything you picked up, that's a museum piece. Everybody wants, that's the most valuable thing in the shop you found there. And I'm looking at this guy who was doing the same thing. I said, but you got three of them. Well, okay, maybe it's not that valuable, whatever. That's so rare, you'll never see another, but there's 6 of them here, whatever. But Flosso, they said everything was that to a guy who could pay, right? So Louis Marks, who ran the Marks Toy Company, his son would come in. He said Flosso's prices went up outrageously because his team came to the potty door. You know what I mean? On the other hand, for a kid who didn't have money, he always made sure they had car fare to get home. He would talk them out of buying like expensive junk and say, look, here's Henry Hayes amateur magician's handbook. Buy this instead, $2. Go home with more tricks than you can fit in your bag. That kind of thing. He was very careful about not like sort of swindling people who couldn't afford it, not taking money from, he was very generous and with his advice and so forth. So there was a duality to it, right? There was one time where there was this like Texas businessman who he just sold him a bunch of junk and took hundreds of dollars from him. And he walked out, and somebody who was there said, after this guy walked out, Flosso said, "What? I shouldn't take it from him? I don't say, he'll go to Tannen's. Lou will take it. Someone's going to take it from him. Money on this stupid stuff he's never going to use. I'll take the money." So it was sort of interesting. And then, of course, he was there for when the world transitioned or started to transition to collectibles, and he made a lot of money off original Horace Golden pieces and Thurston things and letters, some of which were in the shop, right? You had original Houdini correspondence. And, though the real collectors, people like Doc Albo, right, they say, he never charged me too much. If I bought him a Chinese dinner afterwards, we were square. Like he charged very little for some of the things, particularly paper ephemera, right? And it was more of an emphasis in those days on apparatus.
Yeah.
And he wasn't beyond hustling anybody. I think it was Bradley Fields. You might know him. He was a Washington-based magician.
He just passed away, yeah.
Oh, yeah, he was a nice guy. But he was talking about how when Flosso is showing a set of cups and balls, and every magician is going to relate to this, the cup had a little hole in it, so you could run a thread through, and you could attach the ball to a thread, which you could tie to a button or something. So this way you could make the ball appear and disappear at will. It's a really interesting little twist.
Okay.
So he's showing it to some guy who's not buying it. Who's like, it's all right. Are you kidding? Look at this thing. I got the thing with the thread. I could do this and that. So Bradley Fields is watching, and he's young, and he says, Al, can I talk to you for a second? And he pulls him aside from the customer and says, look, let this guy go. I'll buy it from you. I'll pay, And he says, okay, very good, kid, very good. And he turns around to the customer. You hear that guy? This kid here, he wants to buy it. You better buy it, or else this kid's going to buy it. And the customer bought it. And Bradley Fields saying, I'm watching it walk out the door. I'm like, but I wanted it. Nah, I'll get you something else. And so there was always this salesman's, routine about everything was valuable, and he would just hustle one guy against another, to make the sale.
So he had the shop right up until he died.
Correct.
So now Dunninger's hanging out there for the bulk of his life. Who else comes into the shop?
Oh God, everybody who was anybody in magic walked in and out of Flosso's. I only wish, I was there much later when Jackie was running it in his later years. And, I would run into people like Jeff Sheridan and so forth. But if you, or Sal Stone, just really interesting people. Some of the people helped me write the book, actually. George Schindler would come in. But they say in the day, everybody who was anybody in magic stopped in. If they were in town, if they were in New York City, which is a lot, you would get all sorts of people, including people outside of our traditional magic circles. You know what I mean? In other words, if you named a performer, I'd probably say, oh yeah, sure, that guy, this guy, we could go on about it. But, Danny Kaye would come up to the shop. Because Danny Kaye did magic when he performed for the United Nations trips that he would take.
Mm.
Jackie Gleason was great story, right? So Jackie Gleason was a hang around at our shop, particularly when he was down on his luck. And they say, Flosso used to throw him money here and there. Like he'd say, here's $20, here's $50, go get yourself a new suit, and Gleason was having a hard time. Much later, when Jackie Gleason becomes Jackie Gleason, he's got the Honeymooners, his own variety show. To pay him back, he would hire Flosso to build props for the show. So Flosso would go over and build like a growing. The example Jackie gave me was of like a growing tree. They needed for some comedy sketch a tree that kept growing. So he would go and build a little thing, and so to pay him back for all the times he, loaned him money and not returned it, because he was not really a loan; it was a handout.
Yeah.
Gleason would come over and say, "Okay, you built that tree for me. How much do you want, Al?" He said, "I don't know, $25. Something. You make up some low price." $25. And what's that? You want $50? That's outrageous. That's highway robbery. Wait, what do you mean? And he said, no, I didn't say 25. Oh, you're going to argue with me now? You want 75? All right. And he looked at the treasurer on the show. Pay the man $100. Let's call it square. Give him $100, but I don't want to hear from it. But that was the way he said he paid him back over the years. Every time he went, he walked out with $100, $200 for, an hour's work, and that was his way of sort of comping him for that. So it was really an interesting blend of people. And I can't tell you how many people spent their youth, Jamie and Swiss, would talk about going in there and getting to meet different, just these legends.
Yeah.
To pick some stuff up, but more importantly, just sort of to hang out and meet other people. It was a shop, not for profit really, but for talking and meeting and the social aspect and the history of magic. And people really, loved that.
I think that was every magic shop.
Yeah,
at least at a time. But I can't think of any magic shop that really ever really made money. But the social aspect was an important part, and especially if the owner or the dealer had a background in magic, because there's shops where the person that owns it, is a fan of magic but never really did magic. Versus the ones that like Denny Haney, for example, that was a full-time performer.
Yeah. I might say that having grown up in the New York area, I did not spend time at Flosso's. I wish I had. Right, I wasn't really at that level of sort of entry into the field. My dad knew enough to take me to Tannen's, and Tannen's was much. It was very much a professional magician shop in the sense that it wasn't for the tourist trade necessarily.
Gotcha. Okay.
But it was much glitzier. It was much more professional. It was much smoother. Right? They said if you went to Flosso's, if you didn't know what you were doing, you're looking at. Doc Albo, who was the greatest collector there was, said the first time he walked in, he was like outraged. Like this is disgusting. It's this. Oh my God! And he said, but within a few minutes, I'm looking and then I'm seeing this nickel piece or this, this turned wood thing, and I realize this place is full of stuff, but it's just a disaster. So I think that like Tannen's would have been a much smoother operation.
Yeah.
I'll give you one other. David Berglass. You familiar?
Yeah.
So David Berglass tells this great story about he comes, and this is very much Flosso's personality. He comes from England, and he's heard about Flosso's shop. So he visits. He goes up to the shop, and there's a couple of people in there, and Flosso says, "Look at that! It's the amazing David Perglass, all the way from London. Look at that, just in our shop, the famous, world famous. David, watch the shop for me. I got to go to the post office. Out the door, and he leaves for like a half hour. And Perglass says, I've got a cash register full of cash, right? And people behind. And so he just sat there and told them stories for a half hour until Flosso came back from the post office.
That is hysterical. And not unusual, yes. I think.
And what would frequently happen in a shop like this, it was the shop that I knew was quite small. It moved a few times, but it was a relatively small room, and you'd be full of all these collectors and hang around and magicians and whatever. But once in a while, you also would have an interaction with a kid that would drive them all to distraction. Now, this is a pretty common story about Flosso. But if you haven't heard, it's worth you repeating. It was the kid who runs in off the street and says, I want to buy a magic wand. You want to buy a magic wand? Man, I have the wand for you. And he would reach behind the case. And it sounds like something out of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Had a magic wand that was in the glass case, a wood wand, with the metal tips. And he'd hand it to the kid and say, you see this? This was the wand of the great Alexander Hermann. He's a very important magician. I'm going to give this to you. You can have it for $1. And it would work great magic for you. And so the kid would pay him the $1 and bolt out of the room. And the magicians and collectors in the room would, Al, what are you doing? What are you? And he would hold up his hand, 5'2", but he could command the crowd. Hold on. And he'd walk in the back and he'd have a box full of the same exact magic wand, pull one out, slide it back into the glass case and say, Hermann had a lot of wands. And I've heard versions of that with Hermann. I've heard it with Houdini, right? But that was the notion, right? You had all these guys. But the kid came in for $1. He sold them Houdini's wand.
Wow. Yeah, I had heard something like that myself. I couldn't remember if it was a wand or what it was, but it was like, this was Houdini's, and it was the very last one I have, and it's yours for whatever. And then they would walk out, and he'd get another one and put it on the shelf.
Those of us who live in the world of history and collecting in the age of eBay and should think about that, right? We get the provenance of something, and I got this wand here. It was sold by Al Flosso in the 1970s, and it's Houdini's original wand. That's a pretty good story. That's a pretty good provenance, right? Except if you ask people, he sold 700 wands just that way. I have something in the book about he used to sell original Houdini handcuffs. Do you know about that? You're a big Houdini collector.
Okay, that's funny because that's the thing I thought that he sold of Houdini's was like, this is, an original Houdini handcuff.
Well, this one has a better provenance because it was Houdini who would sell them to Flosso because he would go down to the Bowery and for a few dollars, he would buy a gross. That's 144. For those who are math challenged, 144 sets of handcuffs and have them stamped Houdini. It would say Houdini on it. So for Flosso, this was like gold. Like it says Houdini. It's an original Houdini handcuff. I bought it from Houdini. Oh, of course you'd buy that. Now there's another story I have in the book with a collector. Oh, you want one of those? There's a million of them. I got loads of those. I'll get you a pair. It's a gift to you, of no value. Today, somebody not knowing that would probably pay a 4-digit number, right? Thousands of dollars.
Yeah, the Houdini handcuffs go for 4 digits easily.
Right.
And every time I see one, I'm like, you don't know it was Houdini's because they went to Houdini afterwards, and there's like a never-ending supply.
Right. Houdini was just printing them out, right? So, I mean, if you even have that level of provenance, you can show this, DNA, Houdini's DNA is on it, for goodness sakes. Mm-hmm. It's still something he was buying by the gross in the Bowery, right? Barrels full of them, and having some guy stamp Houdini on them, and if also selling them for what they are. I mean, he was telling people, Houdini makes them all the time. Here you go, So kind of interesting, and makes you think about some of the collectibles we chase,
Flosso lives into the 70s.
Correct.
Like 76 or something like that. He's 80 or 81.
I think that's right. I don't have dates in front of me. I think that's
okay. Right. No, that's okay. So does he die of old age or?
He had kidney cancer, and
at
first it went well, and then it went badly, and it was just very sad. all endings are sad, but it's not a good situation.
Yeah.
But he lived a long life. He got to influence magic in so many ways. The fact that this guy goes, in my mind, from the pre-Depression railroad circus era, right, the Clyde G. Barnes circus and so forth, into television, right, where he's doing stuff on Ed Sullivan. He appeared 6-7 times on Ed Sullivan. He was on Wonderama every Sunday morning. He would do many Sunday mornings. He would do things. The thing I mentioned before, I would do working with the Muppets and Jim Henson. I mean, you think about, wow, what a lifespan. You know what I mean? What a world he covered. It was fascinating.
Speaking of fascinating, so you said you didn't necessarily hang out at the shop. How is it that you become the author of Flosso's book?
Yeah, so I'm like the accidental historian. So I started doing. I became interested in magic history in the '90s, and I did start to hang around the shop then when Jackie was running the shop at that time. And I wrote a few things. I wrote something on Horace Golden, and I met Jackie, and I said, your father was kind of famous. We should write something, because what would have been his 100th birthday was coming up.
Okay.
95, or I think 96. So I said, let's write something for his 100th birthday. So we put together a very sort of cursory biographical sketch of Al Flosso. We put it in MUM. And there was some good stories in there, because Jackie was a great raconteur, and I could tell you a little bit more about that. But we put this out, and I did put my email address, which, it's 1990s. Email's new and exciting, right? If people want to read here. And from that, I get notes and letters and cards from everybody in the world. It was unbelievable. I get stuff from Hong Kong. Bob Rossi is over there. Oh, let me talk about Flosso. Everyone felt the urge, the need, the desire to share a Flosso story they had, with me. I heard from Sherry Lewis, right, the famous puppeteer, right, because I had known him, and she learned magic from him. Different people, David Berglass contacted me with his experiences. It was just amazing. And all of a sudden, a few months later, I'm looking at this file, because I kept all the letters and emails I printed out in a file, and I had this file that, I know this is audio, so people can't see me, but I'm holding my hands apart several inches of paper, right? Each one with a story. And I said, I can't let this go to waste. So I decided to build the biography from that. I was very lucky to have Jackie as the resource. So when someone said something to me, he'd say, oh, I forgot to tell you about that. And he would fill me in on some details. The internet was not what it is today. We didn't have Ask Alexander. If I had Ask Alexander, I could have done it in 15 minutes. I literally traveled around the country to read. I went to the Library of Congress to read the old Sphinx magazines. They have the complete bound set. Do you know whose set they have, Dean Carnegie? That was Harry's Houdini set. And there's Houdini's notations in the margins.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm just looking for any time Flosso appeared anywhere, or wrote an article, or somebody wrote a review of him, and it's a page-by-page thing. So I spent days in the Library of Congress getting this great stuff, writing to people, having collectors send me things, clips from magazines and newspapers and different things. So I had kind of a bare bones biography, biographical data about him, some of which might be inaccurate, right? Because a lot of it was oral, right? But I had some of the dates and places, Billboard magazine stuff. But it was really the people coming forward, writing me notes, me getting on the phone with Bill Tarr, getting on the phone with, I can't even begin to tell you the number of people I got to meet through the process, because he had affected so many people in so many different ways. And it was fascinating. And the stories brought it to life, and I could share a few more of those if you wanted, but
please do. Yeah.
I mean, the funny stories, the scary stories, Jane Marshall was just unbelievable, telling me about Flosso doing the Miser's Dream in the 30s with a teenager. And this is a little bit off color, and you might cut this later, but you can decide. He calls a kid up on stage, and he was very big on bringing the kid up on stage as the audience, right? So that kid was the spectator, the witness for the audience. I know that he was doing these small things, producing coins legitimately, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever watch his tapes, I mean, you couldn't do today what he was doing then. He was hands in pockets. He was putting things on him. And anyway, this one kid comes up and Flosso finds a condom in the kid's pocket. It's a teenager. It's the 1930s.
Okay.
So instead of just covering it up, he does my goodness, boy, I don't know what this is. This isn't a coin. This is a very strange thing you've got here. Now the kid is squirming. And instead of ending it there, Flosso just keeps planting it on him again in other pockets. Oh, look at this. You got another one of these things. Oh, you must use these a lot. And another one in his shirt pocket. And G. Marshall said, the kid is just dying, but this is a once in a lifetime for Flosso. He's got a kid with a condom in his pocket. So in addition to the coins here, and there's another one of these. So if you get those kinds of unbelievable pictures, the other one, I think you and I discussed earlier, but I'll just share it in case you want to share this with your listeners. My favorite story, and when people ask me to do readings from the book, this is the page I go to first, was Harry Blackstone. Now, you have to remember, these guys grew up in a world, they're carnies, they're sideshow guys, they're traveling magicians. It was dangerous in some ways, right? There was always the risk of what they used to call a hey rube, where the crowd goes wild on you, being cheated, or God forbid you get involved with the cops, right? So a woman walks up to Flosso. He's done a day's worth of work. He's done 8 shows in a row, and he's sitting there packing up his stuff. And a woman walks up to him and says, "Hey, mister, have you ever heard of a magician named Blackstone?" Now, you and anybody else who knows anything about magic, know Harry Blackstone. Of course you know Harry Blackstone. But Flosso, being a carny, being a sideshow guy, says, Blackstone, and he strokes his chin. Let me ask you a question, madam. Why do you ask? And she then explains that Blackstone had come to town and had slept with her daughter, promised the daughter marriage, something terrible, right? Impregnated her, something awful. And she's looking for him. And Flosso then sits back, says, Blackstone, never heard of him. Never heard of him. Now, for Al Flosso to never have heard of Blackstone, it's ridiculous, but it just shows the kind of world that these guys occupied and the kinds of experiences they had. And when I got stories like that, I said, I got to write this book. That's just too funny. You know what I mean?
That's hysterical. That is funny.
Yeah. So I'm going to add one other thing, if I may.
Yeah.
Working with Jackie Flosso was the greatest, right? Because not only did I work on this book and stuff about his dad, but I then used him as a resource until we lost him in the 90s. I would go, anytime I was writing about anything or anybody, Jackie knew something. It was unbelievable. He had seen more and experienced more. I don't know if Jackie was old enough to see Thurston, or he was just relaying this secondhand from his father. But the first time I met Jackie Flosso, I said, a little bit embarrassed, he said, "You're really interested in magic history. What's that about?" I said, "Well, my grandfather," and this is true. My grandfather saw The Vanishing Horse. Right? He saw Thurston do The Vanishing Horse.
Wow.
And I was a little sheepish about this because I knew that people like Randy had written this is how ridiculous people are. But I said my grandfather believed that he had hypnotized the audience, that the only way to do it was to hypnotize the audience, right? And, look, for us, that's sort of amusing, but, and Flosso, and Jackie Flosso looked at me and said, well, in a way, your grandfather wasn't wrong. Howard Thurston could mesmerize an audience. When Howard Thurston spoke and told the woman to rise, it didn't matter how he was doing it, but he made you believe that he was doing it. So in a weird sense, your grandfather was right. And that was, I almost cried a little bit. I mean, we became friends from that moment.
Wow.
And I would go to him and he would tell me about seeing Blackstone perform when he was a kid, and Blackstone would give away the rabbit, to a kid, and he wanted to get the rabbit. He was crying because he didn't get the rabbit, all that kind of stuff. And I'll give you an idea of how the depth of Jackie Flosso's knowledge. I did a piece on Grover George, somebody you and I know because of the poster collecting, but nobody knows because Thurston sued him out of business within 30 seconds of him starting his career or whatever. Jackie Flosso saw Grover George perform.
Wow.
So he was on the road with his father he was a kid in somewhere in New England. I don't remember where, but he said, it was so sad. He said, I was a little kid. He says, and George got dressed up, and he had this nice costume. And his assistants had these nice kind of these pretty equipment, but we were in this dingy warehouse, this terrible performance venue. And he's like, now I'm going to transport you to the mysteries of the Orient. And we're going to travel to Asia in our minds and we'll see China. And he says, and I'm 8 years old and thinking, well, this isn't China in Morale. But Jackie also had that experience. He saw Grover George perform, right? And so I could draw so many things from him when I would work with him on these things. It was just wonderful. As a historian, it was just everything he said to me, I knew, like, I got to get this down. You know? And I wrote so many little pieces and snippets and posts because he would tell me little things like that, So it was just a great, great experience. And I'm blessed to have had.
Now, was Jackie a performer, or did he take over the shop and just was a dealer?
No, he was very much a performer, and I'm glad you asked me that because it reminds me of something else I wanted to share with you and maybe everybody. He was a performer during World War II. He was in the USO. And he did a lot of nightclub work, a lot of cruise ship work. So his dad continued to run the shop, and he would travel and do different things. I had the rare opportunity to see him perform, and it's because of this night. I have actually a thing right here. I'll show you. You can maybe show us later. This was Monday Night Magic. We did a book launch there, and they did a special show where they brought the Masters of Magic in, and they had Jackie Flosso perform. Presto was there. Wait, hold on. I have Bobby Baxter. You might know.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And Todd Robbins was the MC, and Frank Brentz. Right. So I get to be backstage with that group of guys, these guys who have been performing for decades and decades. Yeah. And my role was I did a little reading from the book, and we ran a video of Flosso doing The Miser's Dream. And for me, that was the greatest because I knew that video by heart, but I got to watch the crowd. And in the dark, right, they darkened, they put out the lights, and in the reflections from the screen, I got to see everybody just mesmerized and hysterical and laughing and cheering and clapping at this act in a can from decades earlier, But also, getting to be backstage with Jackie and Presto and these guys who've been around, they were so nervous going out on stage. They were walking around, pacing, chewing on toothpicks, and walking around, squeezing the back of chairs, trying to get calmed down. I'm thinking, okay. It's good that I'm nervous too. Like, in other words, these guys are such seasoned pros and they still get that sort of butterfly thing before they perform. Everybody does. That's okay. But I got to see Jackie perform that night, and he was quite talented. He was a very funny stand-up comedy magician that you would want in a nightclub setting.
Wow.
As were those other guys. They were all great.
I had no idea that Jackie was also a performer. Yeah. That is amazing. No,
and quite good. It's just so smooth and polished, and these guys can entertain with anything. Yeah, Presto did the electric chair act, which you've never seen. Is just too funny to believe. I mean, just lighting torches with his tongue and just shocking the audience members. It was just super. It was super.
Wow. Now, between Al and his son, did they ever write any books, or everything they did was basically verbal?
So there wasn't a lot of writing there. Again, remember, I don't remember. I thought I knew this at one time. I don't even know how far Al got in school. I don't think he may not even finish high school, right? So there wasn't a great deal of writing there. Jackie wrote one or two little clown books, things about different clowns, gags and stuff. Okay. The one thing that Al kind of edited is in the hard copy of this. I would get this wrong because it's Our Mysteries, which I didn't know this at the time, and I'm sorry about that. It's a compilation of tricks by people like Roy Benson and Al Baker, and one from Flosso, Harbin, Think and Drink Hoffman, and Eugene Laurent. This was done to help somebody. I want to say John Mulholland.
Okay, I remember this book.
Yeah, and I reprinted it as part of the Coney Island Fakir. The whole thing was reprinted here because Jackie owned the rights to it. So I said, let's put it in here and get it out there again because people hadn't seen it. And I tell you, there are a couple of tricks in there that you could build a stage act around. There's some magic in here that's so good. Again, I'm not 100% sure. I think it was one of the named magicians. I think it was Mulholland who was just down on his luck, and they gave him all the proceeds.
Okay.
But that was the only thing that Flosso sort of authored. He only wrote one trick in there. I guess he probably had somebody else actually do the writing. He provided the trick.
Gotcha.
Interestingly, and we didn't mention this, Pop Krieger, which was Flosso's father-in-law. right? So he was a famed magician who worked with Max Malini. You probably will cite us to an episode, something or other, in a moment. But Pop Krieger, I did a little work on him. That was one of the reasons I tried to expound on some other magicians who haven't been covered, just the way you do in your wonderful, and I mean this, podcast. I did a little background on Pop Krieger, and you read his literature, and he talks about he's the prince of magicians, and he's the king, and he's performing for royalty in Europe or whatever. In truth, he was illiterate. He didn't write any of those things. He's covered very little in the magic magazine because it required you at least to write letters saying, I'm now in the Catskills and I'm performing for this family or whatever. There's very little of that on Pop Krieger because he was illiterate. So although he was the prince and professor and whatever, these guys had it rough. They didn't have a lot of formal education. But we tend to look at it through this sort of lens, right, where everybody has goes to college and whatever.
Yeah.
These guys, they had it rough. They were out there performing for their dinner. I think Flosso started performing in sideshows when he was 14, so they didn't get too far in school.
Well, this has been an education. And now let me ask you, is the book still available?
It's okay. So you can find the hard copies are hard to find. They've become a collector's item of itself. L&L put this out in the 90s and has been republished. You can see them on eBay now and then, but they're hard to find. However, anybody who wants to read it, for $4, it's on the Kindle. I put it there just so people would have it. It doesn't have the pictures. It's not as nicely dressed up, but it's a good story. And for $4, you can get it on the Kindle if you can't find the original book. I recommend the original book if you can find it, but they're hard to get.
I got my copy on eBay. I think there were 3 copies, so it's still out there. But I love the fact that it's available to any. But for $4, you can't beat that. So that's
if you find an original on eBay, right, and you can send me a self-addressed stamped envelope and a sticker, you can have an autographed copy.
Oh, well, I'm sending him mine. Once I get it, it's in Virginia. Very cool. Well, thank you for being our first interview for the Magic Detective podcast. I think it was a tremendous success, and I think our listeners are going to be happy to have heard the stories and learned a lot about Al Flosso.
On behalf of all your listeners, I just want to say thank you for everything you're doing. You're doing incredible work on this, and you're taking up stories that should be told, should be preserved, and it's hard, and we all are grateful for that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And with that, we're going to call it a night. Everybody, thank you for listening to the Magic Detective podcast. Please remember, if you liked this episode, like it in the, wherever you can on your podcasting device. And if you don't mind, consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, because that gets more people to hear it when you do that. And my name is Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective. We had Gary Brown with us tonight talking about Al Flosso from his wonderful book, The Coney Island Fakir, The Magical Life of Al Flosso. Thank you once again, everybody. Have a great week and be safe. Okay.
Oh, wait, before we go.
Yes.
This is something you don't know about. I don't think. This was the murder of Arnold Rothstein. This was a little extra pamphlet I used to give people when they bought the book for me, and I put it online for a while. And Flosso knew who killed Arnold Rothstein, the gambler.
Really?
Yes. Now, here's what happens. I'm going to tell you the story. You decide whether you want to use it on air. It might be too involved. But one day, Jackie tells me this after the book comes out. Oh, my dad knew who killed him. I said, what do you mean? And we got this from Jay Marshall, who knew it, but he didn't know who again. So I go back to Jackie and said, oh, I never told you that story. It's this guy McManus, who was actually accused of the murder in the first instance, but they lost the evidence, and it was Tammany Hall politicians, it was all corrupt and whatever. And Flosso knew a guy who knew McManus, and eventually he knew him, and McManus confessed to Flosso, okay, and said, yeah, I was the one who did that, right? But Flosso always kept that under his hat, and then it was until the guy was long dead that he eventually shared it with his son and shared it with a couple of magicians. Now, I put that out in this little website that I had with the book, right?
Okay.
Cute story. I wrote it like a Damon Runyon thing. A couple years later, there's this. I'm in a bookstore, and there's this definitive like biography comes out about Arnold Rothstein, written by some college professor. It's this thick, and I'm thinking, I wonder if I got it right. You know what I mean? Like, so I look it up, and you turn the page, and it says, how did he die? And it says, meet Al Flosso. He's a 5'2" magician. There's the Coney Island Fakir, and it relays the story of how Flosso knew that McManus did it and confessed to him. And then there's a little like asterisk footnote thing, and you turn to the back of the book, and they cite my website. So I made history from a story that I hope is true. I think is true, but I'm not so sure. So if you want to use that, we can do that. Yeah.
That's funny. That is funny.
A little human historical artifact as such.